Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining in this, I think, slightly complicated story I'm going to tell you. I'd like to take you basically back to the essence of the journalistic economy, of the journalistic industry, to try to find where our problem is, because we do have a problem in journalism, obviously. There's much spoken about in these days here as well. And the essence of what we're trying to do in the Netherlands at this moment is to identify that we have an old system that is centralized and institutional. It's media companies that are centralized and institutional. And we feel that we're moving towards a networked system. And we call it distributed journalism. And distributed means, in this respect, away from centralized institutional towards networked and distributed. And we believe that it is a model that will create vital and sustainable journalism. And these are two important words. And they have a lot in common. Vital and sustainable. Vital means on the ball, sharp, holding powers accountable, optimally informing people, and enabling them to be informed and be part of their community. And sustainable means that we make money with journalism. Now, the thing is, a lot of money is being made with journalism, only not by journalists. And there's a problem. Now, if you look at any market, any industry, it's all about demand and supply. And also in our industry, there is a demand. People need to know, people have the right to know, so there's a large urge for high-level quality information. On the supply side, that's not really a problem. On the supply side, there's great journalists, there's great journalism, and so forth. So, supply and demand might not be the issue. Between supply and demand is an intermediary, somebody who helps to bring information, in our case, to readers and viewers. And in our case, that's publishing or media companies that do that. And they basically do two things. Their role is two things. One, they monetize. So that means they buy a piece from a journalist and they sell it to their readers and they make money doing that. And they offer a production infrastructure. So they used to have big factories to print newspapers and deliver them and so forth. So they monetize, they create the money, and they facilitate in a supporting infrastructure for you as journalists to do your work. So let's take a look at demand. Now, the demand for high quality information has never been higher before. Information is a very critical product, both professionally and personally. I need to be well informed, to be able to confer with people and have discussions. We have a much larger group of highly educated people for whom information is important. So volume is up. Accessibility to content is up. It's much easier to share it and to find it and so forth. So that's no problem. The cost to reach our audiences are way down. It's a lot cheaper and a lot easier to find people that could be interested in our product. Now, the reader, of course, is more critical and more mobile than he or she used to be. My father had a newspaper, he listened to the radio and he had a newspaper and he sat at the mailbox in the afternoon waiting for his newspaper to arrive, and he was a very loyal customer. Today's customer, of course, is much more mobile and goes around. So that means that it's much more important to make a good match between what the reader is looking for and what we are providing as a journalist. And of course, the reader is shattered all around the cloud and reading stuff at Politico, at Wall Street Journal, at Volkskrant, he or she is everywhere. And the key question, of course, is the customer willing to pay for journalism? And there's many people who say, well, news, nobody wants to pay for news. That's a ridiculous concept for two reasons. For one, with bringing news and information to people, we bring value. That is a value proposition. That is something that is important for people. And if there's something of value, then people are willing to pay for it. Secondly, we're not asking them to pay. Jeff Bezos said, Washington Post, he said, we are not optimally asking people to pay, and we're not enabling them to pay. We have sustained old models, subscription models, to have people pay for us. That is a model that's not working anymore. So the concept of people not wanting to pay for content is ridiculous. Look at it. I mean, only in Europe, billions of euros are spent on journalism by people having subscriptions to newspapers and other things. So people are willing to pay. We have to help them and support them in doing that, and ask it. Supply side. Now, there's one pretty big issue. The supply of journalism is up. There's a lot more information out there than there used to be. So it's a lot harder to connect the reader with the content. My father, again, had this one newspaper. Now I can, and my children can choose from any source in anywhere in the world. So there's a lot more supply and a lot more to choose from. But the means to produce journalism are way up. We now have Google, we can search, we have data, we can do so it's cheaper and more and easier to produce content. And I think one very important thing is that the capacity to specialize as a journalist is now easier than it used to be. Traditional newsrooms are generic newsrooms, and a journalist is a storyteller. So as a journalist, you can tell a story about this chair, or about a bank, or about the IMF. And I talked to a chief editor of a newspaper in the Netherlands, and he said, with us, people circulate. So you're 3 years in the arts department, and then you move to the economics department. So that's odd. So me as a reader, I'm reading something about a bank from someone who 2 weeks ago was in the arts department. So in the new networked environment, as a journalist, you can specialize. So take the example of the International Monetary Fund. And me as a journalist, I will specialize on that topic. So I know everything about it. It's easier and cheaper for me to produce because I know what things are about. And that means that I can create higher value and better journalism by being specialized. So I think that's a great asset of new times. Financial resources are down. Right? We all have a money problem. There's no money for investigative journalism. That's not true. That is not true. The total amount of money going around in an industry is not very strongly changed. And there's a lot of money that we're not taking in, that we're not bringing in. So I don't at all feel that we would have a financial problem. Lastly, the market is very competitive. That means that bad journalism, there's no place for bad journalism anymore. Is there a place for excellent journalism? Absolutely. If you create a piece that totally captures what I'm looking for, then there's a place and a market. So the problem, of course, is not, hopefully you'll agree, is not in demand, it's not in supply, it's in the publishing arena. So let's take a look at the traditional publishing company. There is a newsroom. So take the example of a Dutch newspaper, Volkskrant. I think they have 180 people coming in the morning creating pieces. That's the institutional newsroom, traditional newsroom, sorry. They distribute that information through their two sources, online and the newspaper. And 6% of the Dutch population has a subscription to the Volkskrant. So here's somebody creating, it's true. Anyway, so here's somebody creating an article which costs money, and it's being distributed to a very small population of total, right? That's interesting. So, I'm doing the wrong thing. They distribute that to their subscribers and readers. So this is basically the economic chain of journalism. We have production, we have distribution, and we have consumption. And this is owned by a media company. So it's owned by somebody who invested and bought a company, and he or she owns it. Okay. Now, what does a newsroom do? One thing very important, they make a selection for me. So that's great because I can't follow everything that's going on, so there's a group of people who make a selection for me every day. Now, if there's 200 things they can write about each day, potentially, then they only can write about 30. That's the average production of a newspaper. That means they also make a selection for me what I'm not reading. So yes, they're showing me what they thought was interesting for me to read, but they're showing me a lot of things that they've chosen not to write about. But that's one asset of a newsroom. They do production. So 180 people in this specific newspaper are writing articles and creating content. That's good. And they're quality validation. So if something is in NRC Handelsblad or Wall Street Journal, I know it's valid, it was produced ethically, and so forth. That's the traditional role of a newsroom. If you look at is this correct? Excuse me. Yeah. Now, and this is a known concept in other industries. You see it in energy, for example. We used to have institutionalized, centralized means to produce in last century. And one big movement in societies around the world basically is a move from centralized towards distributed. Many people in the Netherlands and Germany are now creating their own local energy thing, so that movement. And basically the same thing is happening in publishing. Production is moving away from centralized institutional solutions to a network of freelancers. 30 to 40% is now being produced by freelancers, and it's expected to go up to 60, 70, or 80%. So freelancers will be producing the bulk of the content in journalism, which I think is a good thing. Because journalists, for one, has the capacity, again, to specialize. And I think a freelance, specialized journalist is a better journalist than a generic journalist. Sorry if I offend anyone. So production is moving away from central to decentral. The reader is moving away from central to decentral. The reader's in the cloud. He or she is out there and going around and finding information. And that happens through social media. 60 to 70 to 80 to 90% of traffic with traditional companies comes through social media. So that means that where traditionally someone would go to the Volkskrant and say, well, what have they decided to make today? I'm going to the Volkskrant and see their selection. Their traffic now comes from people from the cloud that received a tweet about an interesting article, click on that and refer to the specific website. So that means that the traditional push model of a newspaper, we've created this and here you go and this is all the information you need and you read it, is effectively online non-existent. It is now a disclosing type of publishing. The reader goes around the cloud and finds his or her content. And a lot is said about Google and Facebook, but they are instruments that help to connect a reader to journalism. So in all aspects, production, distribution, and consumption, it's moving away from centralized bundled propositions to decentralized propositions. Now, this is very interesting. Here again we have the traditional media company, and they get their revenues, and I've taken this from figures from Dutch newspapers. 70% readers, that used to be 50%, and then about 40 to 50% advertising. Then about 30% advertising and other. There's other sources, retailing for example, so there's some other resources. If you look at the cost base, this is interesting. 18% of revenue goes to profit and amortization. Right? So Mrs. Jones pays 100 euros for her subscription, pays 100 euros for journalism, and 18% of that goes to profit and amortization. 25% goes to overhead. So there's a CEO and he makes 600,000 euros, which is fine, but 25% to 30% goes to overhead of the company. Distribution is 30%. Journalism is about 25%. That's a gross figure. So that means that the secretary of the chief editor is included in that 25%. So effectively, anywhere between 15 to say 25% of our total revenue is spent on journalism. More interestingly, about 3 to 5% of total revenue is spent on journalists, on freelancers. Now that's odd because they make 30% of the journalist, of the production. And that is something to think about economically. Many media companies are still profitable, which is strange because they've lost a lot of revenue and still they're profitable. So they've cut cost. Where have they cut cost? In their newsroom. By firing journalists and hiring them back as freelancers because they're a lot cheaper, they don't have a pension, they don't have insurance and that type of thing. So we've moved a lot of production out to cheaper resources. So that means, and in the Netherlands we had quite a crisis of a person that worked for a local newspaper and made 50 euros a day. 50 euros a day. I mean, that's not good. So part of the profits of the current media companies are based on underpaying their journalists. And if they were to normalize paying journalists, then their revenue, their profits would drop down. So I always say we have a bigger crisis financially than we even think. So my saying is we don't have a crisis in journalism. We have a crisis in production. We have a crisis in the infrastructure that is all that is legacy, that monetizes and sells our product. So that means that we'd have to resolve the problem in publishing. And going back to demand and supply, basically what we're seeing happening, so I hope this works, yes it works, is that demand and supply through the online community are finding each other. If I follow Jay Rosen, then I'm totally informed about anything that happens in the world about media innovation. Because he knows it and he tweets it, I follow him and I read the article as well. And if Jay Rosen says it's an interesting article about media innovation, he's a great curator and I will read the article. So supply and demand are easily capable of finding each other. So that means that the role of the publisher will have to change for two reasons. And I made this thing a little smaller. I think the legacy publisher will have to change to a facilitating role. So not a monetizing, owning role, but a facilitating role. And he or she has to focus on creating the match between supply and demand. I think that's the new role of the publishing company. So, what will happen? I'm crossed with the publishers for two reasons. One, they have not been able to transit to a new model. The market has changed fundamentally from 10, 20 years ago, fundamentally. And their model is exactly the same as it used to be. The subscription model and the paywall, which is now the big thing, are adaptations of traditional models. And they've not been able to go along with the change. So, and if they don't change, then they will die. And I think the legacy model of the traditional push publishing is dead. So, hopefully, legacy players, so traditional media, will transit in a new role of facilitating. Okay, that comes later. And I think there will be new intermediaries that will enter the market. And Google, of course, is a very important intermediary. They help me as a reader to connect to content. So I'm a fan of Google. I think they do a great job in helping us as journalists as well. Revenue diversification. I've taken out a slide. A traditional company would have two sources of revenue, advertising and subscriptions. And I was involved in a report where we identified 52 ways to make money. So we have to diversify the way that we make money. One thing, for example, is crowdfunding. And a traditional newspaper would not do crowdfunding. Why not? Why not say, guys, we have to investigate what's going on and this and that, and so help us with additional money. And that's going back to Jeff Bezos. We're not asking people. We're not asking people to donate for certain things and so forth. So we're lacking in diversifying and broadening the means to make money. But interestingly, if we don't need an intermediary anymore between supply and demand, then I, as a freelancer, can publish directly. If I'm a specialist on the IMF and you want to have information about the IMF, you can find my article. The one thing is, how do I monetize? How do I make sure that you pay me for reading that article? And I think that revenues will shift and will have to shift to journalists, and not to our infrastructure, but to journalists. Because, of course, independent, vital, sustainable journalism has to do with economic autonomy for a journalist. If a journalist makes 4,000 to 5,000 to 6,000 euros a month, then we have independent people that are economically capable of being a good journalist. Yeah, just a few things. Again, we have a report, you can find it somewhere online, that we identified 52 ways. I've taken out a couple of things. And basically, for now, I want to focus on the first one, which is paper art. The publishers have a subscription model, which is really good. So I have to stand here. Because people pay in advance. And people use about 20% of the product that they buy. So I take a subscription to a newspaper, and on average, I use about 18% of the articles that I can read. So that's a great thing. I sell you, something you only use. So subscription is great for publishers. But from all the readers that would potentially read my stuff, I can only get about 5 to 10% of the people to take a subscription. I have 3 subscriptions. So I have one to the Parool, and I will not take a subscription to the Financieel Dagblad in the Netherlands. But I want to read 20 to 15 articles, 15 to 20 articles per year. So basically, the Financieel Dagblad says, no. If you want to read our stuff, you have to take a subscription. You have to buy everything, 400 euros a year. No, I don't want to. I want to buy that one article. No, you can't. You have to buy everything. So what we really need to do is create a system where I can go, I read an article, I come to Politico, and it's a great article, and I can click on a button and I can pay 20 cents, or 50 cents, or 60 cents. We have to understand that we have to leave the bundled proposition and come to a consume and pay per article. Now that system exists. It's called Blendle. There are other means. Is everybody familiar with Blendle by any chance? Blendle is an online kiosk that has a lot of publications, Wall Street Journal and so forth, and you can go there, you can read one article, and you pay 60 cents. Buy a button. Now what is interesting, that button can also be put on a regular website. So in the Netherlands, there's one newspaper who has that button on their website. So when I come, they say, do you want a subscription? No. Do you then want to pay 60 cents for the article? Yes. And I click it, and I read the article. So I think paying per article, consuming per article is a crucial new development. What should legacy media do? I think, and that sounds very odd, a media company produces content and distributes content. That's a weird concept. There's no other economy who does that. There's a tomato farmer who farms tomatoes, he sells it to the factory, makes it into soup, sells it to the restaurants, who sells it to me as a customer. And we have our own production and our own distribution. That is silly. And that is not the value. If I read a magazine, I want good journalism. I don't care where they got it. I used to be the director of a magazine, and we bought great pieces from the Atlantic. We just bought it, $500, and we republished it in our magazines. So separate production from distribution and become, I think, a distribution brand. Embrace the concept of single sales, which is terribly hard for legacy players to do, because they're afraid that it will, undermine their subscription model. And syndication. I think syndication is a wonderful concept. Now, coming back to this Volkskrant that has 1.5% of the Dutch population that they have as subscribers. So here we're creating an article, say a research article that will cost 2,000 euros, that one article to produce. And we're selling it into one little store, only one place where people can come and buy. That's really silly. Why not sell it in 2 stores, or 3 or 4 or 5? If you sell it in more places, make it available in more places, then you have more people buying your product. That's very simple. So why not reuse content? Why not take an article that was written about Mrs. Merkel in Germany, translate it and reuse it in your local newspaper? Because just imagine what it does to the efficiency of our industry if we do not all produce our own content. Diversify revenues, and I think innovate the role of freelancers. We had a great conversation in the Netherlands where a newspaper said, what we can do, you as a freelancer can publish on our site. We put the Blendle button in and we share the revenue. So I don't pay you for the article, but we share the revenue. That's a really great concept, both for the newspaper as well as for the freelancers. I mean, that's the sort of innovation of your relationship with the freelance community. Or something else. So this was what I think is the change in the market. This is what I think that legacy players should do. Or new players will enter the market. And this is effectively describing what we've done in the Netherlands. We've created a company called De Cooperatie, and this is the schedule. So coming back to the newsroom, from centralized to an ecosystem of all sorts of freelancers, distribution is also becoming decentral and the readers in the cloud. So what if you say, how about we support that ecosystem of freelancers? So we make sure they have places to work, that they're insured, that they have everything they need, and so forth. So we replicate the support that they used to have in traditional environment, and we make it available for the freelance community. What if we create our own fund? We create a fund. We gather money, and with that fund, we support investigative journalism by freelance journalists. What if we would provide these freelance journalists with websites? Free of charge. You can have it, it's up tomorrow, and you create your own domain. So I'm the IMF expert again, so I create imf.nl, and I write and I publish my pieces there on the IMF. And what if we support those websites with the Blendle button, so people can pay me for the article? What if we put a donation button in there so people can support me for investigative stuff? What if we put advertising in there, so me as a journalist, I don't need to worry about advertising, it will come directly onto the website and the revenue goes to me as a journalist, and so forth. What what if we would create a network of 1,000 freelance journalists, 100 websites that they run, that they own, the money that coming in goes to them, and we drive those websites with Facebook. So we say, here's an article about a chess player in the Netherlands, and we will use Facebook to drive everybody who's interested in chess to that one article, and they pay 30 cents to read the article. If 10,000 people pay 30 cents, you have 3,000 euros. We have this running, and we have instances of freelancers making 5,000 euros in 2 days with one article. Very simple. Because there were 20,000 people reading the articles. And that's not very hard to do. And 5,000 euros is a lot of money. If you were to do that, you basically created a new media company that is collectively owned, it's cooperative, it's owned by the makers, and 60 to 90% of revenue goes to the makers. So that's interesting. There's no change in revenue. Revenue is the same. Mrs. Jones still pays 100 euros for journalism, but it's not 3 to 5% that goes to the journalist, but it's 95% that's going to a journalist. Let me see what this is. Okay. Now what if you have 700 freelancers producing work, about 700 articles per month? You have those 60 websites, and all that content is in a central content database. So you have 700 articles that you can internally syndicate. So each freelancer in the network can use articles from that database to put on his or her website and share it. If you have that database, then you can make that into the cloud. All of a sudden you have a database of that grows with 700 to 1,000 articles per month. And you can make it, available to legacy media. So where you're probably familiar with a database of photos where an editorial team can go and find a photo of whomever. There's now a database of articles, of journalistic articles, and any legacy media can go in there and find an article about CRM, buy the article for 50 euros, and then the money goes to the freelancer. So yet again, another source of revenue for the freelancer. This is all up and running. So this exists. We currently have 700 people and 60 websites. Now what if we would replicate this model for local purpose? So we replicate this model and we put it in Groningen or in Bruges. We have 4 or 5 local journalists setting up a little cooperative and have the total infrastructure and start, Perugian news by themselves, run by themselves, owned by themselves, monetized by themselves. What if we would take it to Hungary and say we take a group of people, 6 freelance journalists, and we provide the whole total publishing infrastructure at no cost, and they start working, we help them monetize, and they're autonomously economically. What would happen if we take it to Syria? What would happen if, anyway, that goes by themselves. What would happen if we replicate and recreate this model? I'm not talking to people in Canada and in UK to connect to this. Then all of a sudden we have maybe 10,000 freelance journalists around the world connected in the same system that produce 8,000 pieces a month. 8,000 pieces a month. That have a fund of 10 million to support investigative journalism, and that has maybe 1,000 websites. And basically we've created the largest media company that ever existed. Being a network company, being owned by the makers. And I think that's it. Any questions? Any dispute? Go ahead. I think you were the first. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. You talked about Blender. I heard it was a big success in the Netherlands, but it wasn't so successful in the United States and in Germany.
Yeah.
And they were not able to launch in France because the current editors were not on board. Well, all of the editors were not on board. So maybe Blender is like the exception to the rule, and that other initiative about payments per article eventually failed. It's the case in France, at least.
Yeah. What I'm saying is that we need to make sure, if I spend 10 minutes of my time on an article, it needs to be a really good match. I really want to read an article that adds value for me. So I think the market is shifting towards an article-based consumption thing. So then we need to think about how we monetize that. And the micropayment, which is a very generic thing, I can buy a CD or a song for 90 cents. A micropayment, I think, is the way to go. Blendle is a good example because it's the one payment infrastructure that also has users. And I talked to Google because they have OnePass. They introduced OnePass, and that was exactly the same thing. So you have a wallet. The problem with micropayments is that the cost of transaction is too high. If I pay 29 cents, the cost of the transaction is 30 cents, so it's a loss making. But if you make a wallet on which I put 10 euros a month, and then I do the then you resolved it. So it doesn't need to be Blendle. I'd love for Google to start it and say, okay, there's now a payment infrastructure that allows publisher to put a button on any article and ask you to pay 10 cents or 20 cents. So it doesn't need to be Blendle, but we need a micropayment infrastructure, in my view. Again, if your total readership of potential readers is 100,000, then you will not be able to generate more than 5,000 to 10,000 subscriptions. So that means the rest of the market's gone. You're not making any money of all these other people that would want to read 20 articles per year on your website. It's a total waste of money. There's a lot of volume there, and we're not capturing it because we don't have a means to transfer that money. And I'm saying if we do, then we are opening up huge amounts of money. Maybe at the cost of subscription models, but that's not my problem. That's the problem of the other publishers. Anything else?
With your model, we are switching from journalism as a collective endeavor to an individual practice of journalism. So it can be a problem for journalists that are not working very well alone at home, that need help from the colleague, that need leadership from an editor, that need trainings from. This is a. I'm a freelancer, so I love your model. I have no problem, but I know that freelancing is not for everyone.
No, I know, and that's why in Amsterdam we have a big office. And we have 45 freelancers working there. They come in the morning and they work together and they have lunch together and they exchange together, and there's a young technical team there that they play around with. So I think that's a very important element. We have trainings. Every Friday there's a training about CEO, about whatever. And we have a collective insurance. So what we're trying to do is all the things that you as a journalist maybe with a legacy company have, maybe even a pension. You know, I'm very eager to look into pensions for freelancers. So we replicate all these things. And one of the great things is that in this respect, they are part of a community again. That really helps. And they collectively launch new websites. You know, 3 or 4 people sat down and they started a new website on healthcare. Really cool. Yeah. Any other question? No dispute against anything I said? Oh, there you go.
My ignorance if I didn't get anything, but to understand this correct, is this kind of the ProPublica model, but ProPublica is producing its content for other media companies while you are producing it for single-paying readership? But could it be watched like as a parallel in terms of the producing side, like ProPublica? Is it inspired by that model?
I don't think so. The big parallel is Medium.com. Do you know Medium? Medium.com is America, and anyone can publish on there. Now, there's 2 problems. Anyone can publish on there, so we said basically we want a platform where only journalists can publish. And Medium.com does not have a revenue source. They're now playing with subscriptions, I think. So basically, it's Medium.com, a big platform where any journalist can publish and monetize. That's a better comparison than ProPublica. And ProPublica is financed with funds more. It's not really a business model, but you had a question too.
Thank you. How does your model replicate the role of editors?
What's an editor exactly? Stupid question, but because in Dutch, an editor is somebody who corrects the last mistakes and that sort of thing. Is that what you mean?
Partly, I guess, yeah.
Or a chief editor, or a person that makes the selections and so forth.
I can see why in your model the element of the role of an editor that perhaps coordinates sort of a line between articles is unnecessary.
Yeah, no.
But in terms of, let's say, checking simply and working from there.
No, we don't have that. So one of our biggest websites is called Reporters Online, and there are literally 700 journalists publishing on Reporters Online. I think 15 of them are now making a good living doing that. So it's pretty cool. And they all publish directly onto the platform. We have editors, if they need, could you take another look, that's fine, but they publish directly. So that's evil, like, oh, there's mistakes in there. They're not mistakes. It doesn't happen, because they publish under their own name. So if you write up anything stupid, better not. And what we see is that the selection is in a network. If there's a great article, then it's being picked up and there's revenue. If it's a bad article, it doesn't sell. So there's a sort of automated selection in there that works really well in practice. And there's another great example that I didn't anticipate on. We had an article about the sex life of a famous Dutch actress, and it was published on Reporters Online. By the way, it was republished. It had already been published somewhere else, and the author just republished it again. So we thought, great, we're going to make a lot of money. We didn't make any money, because people want to read the article, but they don't want to pay for it. And what we see is that people want to pay for content that really, really adds value. That really, after reading, they say, wow, I didn't know that, or had a great perspective. Those articles do very well. So the single payment, actually, there's many people who say, you'll be just writing trash and making a lot of money. That's not the case. People only pay for something that adds value for them. So we don't have a chief editor, and we don't have editors. No, and we have one court case only in 2 years. So that's okay. Anything else? No? No. Thank you very much.